Welcome, folks.
We're talking at the same time. Good evening, everyone. We'll be starting at 7, so we've got 2 minutes exactly to just settle in. And as always, you probably know the drill by now, microphones off if possible, well, not if possible, that's the request, and cameras on if possible. Today we will be talking about Socratic questioning. And what I will ask you to mention in your comments, please, because this is not the first Thursday on Socratic questioning we're doing. I think it's third, if not fourth, at least third, I think it is. So I'll be very interested to know whether you've attended any previous SDS Thursdays with Paul on Socratic questioning, and whether you've attended SDS course on Socratic questioning. It's a 2-day course, which Paul will be running in March. I will obviously mentioning it as we start looking at the courses which are coming up. So it'll be very, very useful for us to know whether you've done that training with us and maybe share with your fellow participants whether you liked it or not, because I know that since we started offering it on Zoom, we even had people waking up in the middle of the night in Australia and coming and doing Socratic questioning workshop with us. Socratic questioning workshop, I will be mentioning it again as well, is not available as a recording after the course. This Thursday will be available as a recording, but the workshop itself is not available as a recording because it is experiential and we need you to be in the room when it's happening. So it is one of the very few courses when we insist upon you being in the room because you need to practice the exercises. And another course which happens in the same way is a 3-day experiential workshop on ACT practitioner skills. Again, incredibly useful, very popular, but again, you have to come to live events for that particular course. Yeah, so yes, thank you for your comments. I can see them. We always read them afterwards. I can't probably manage to read them all properly while I'm talking, but we always read them afterwards and try to react to themes and suggestions which we find in your comments. But please carry on. My questions were where you are in the world, what setting you're working in, why are you interested in Socratic questioning, and whether you've done any training with SDS seminars on Socratic questioning, either as SDS Thursday or as a full Socratic questioning workshop, which is taking place over 2 days. As always, while people are gathering, and I'm always very grateful to those who are here on time, believe me, and I do close the room usually after I finish speaking, I do close the room because it's incredibly distracting, especially for me, carrying on watching the waiting room. So what we say in the email is true. We do close the room. But for now, I want to share my screen and just let you know what events are coming your way in February and March. So as always, SDS front page, you're familiar with that because that's where you're registered for SDS Thursdays, and you can immediately see what's coming up in upcoming events. If you want to see more than 3 events which are coming your way, you click on waiting room, please, Paul. I can't click on anything while waiting room is full. No? Still?
No, waiting room's dealt with, yeah.
Okay, now I can open. Thank you. So you can go on all courses and then you click on calendar view and that's where you see the full calendar. Actually, it's even more dates than you see for individual courses, because this is the full calendar of things which are coming up. So the only event which we're running in February is CBT introductory course. It is a very useful course, and it is a certificate in its own right, BPS approved certificate in CBT, Introduction to CBT, and it is a starting point for several certificates and diplomas. It's a starting point for Master Practitioner Diploma in CBT. It's a starting point for BPS approved certificate in working with children and adolescents. This is live event, and all the other events are recorded and they're online with the test and certificate. So it's BPS approved certificate in working with children and adolescents. It's a starting point for BPS approved certificates in CBT techniques and in CBT skills. So quite a few certificates start with CBT introductory course. That's why it's always popular, and that's why, because May course is fully booked as well, we opened up new dates for you in June. Yes, 14th to 16th of June, and there's still availability, and it's availability with early bird discount. So if you are considering doing CBT introductory course with Paul, please book early, because we don't want to disappoint you, but this course really books very quickly. And then in March, on the 2nd and 3rd of March, we are doing Socratic Questioning workshop. Places are still available, but as you can imagine, because we're working experientially live, the places are limited. So if after today, after tonight, you decide to book it, don't leave it very long. And again, tonight is the last day of early bird discount. So if you book it tonight, you still can book it with early bird discount, and it will be going up tomorrow. Okay, that's Socratic Questioning workshop. I want to draw attention of everyone who did supervision training with us. Again, another very popular course, Essential Supervision Skills, and it's BPS certificate in clinical supervision. We have a course which will be delivered by Dr. Andrew Reeves, a former chair of BACP, and Dr. Reeves will be offering a course on the challenges of supervising risk in counseling and psychotherapy. This is a course which we accept as the course extending your SDS accreditation in clinical supervision. So if you've done supervision training with us quite a while ago and want to confirm your accreditation with us, please consider this course. 2 half days, 6 CPD hours, 8th and 9th of March. And Andrew, whoever who's seen him in SDS Thursdays or did suicide training with him, he is an amazing tutor, incredibly informed, thoughtful, compassionate. It's a real pleasure working with him, so I can highly recommend this course. And another thing I want to mention, previous Thursday last week, we had Deanne Jade presenting on eating disorders in adolescents. Her courses are coming up in March, 3 days, 14th, 15th, and 16th, but only 2 hours on each topic, so 6 hours altogether, and you still can book all 3 courses together. If you click here on eating disorders in adolescents, you can book all 3 courses together with a special price for combined booking, which consists of super early bird discount on each 3 courses. So that's a very good offer and good thing to do. So I do highly recommend you to consider that. So I've left out working with resentfulness. It's our module of BPS approved certificate in working with common life challenges. Everyone who's been to jealousy course in February, I highly recommend you coming on resentfulness, because we will be talking of past hurt, betrayal, and how to move on from that sort of experience. So for anyone who worked with jealousy, I think it's an incredibly important course to follow that up with. Okay, so these are the courses which are coming up. And another thing I want to recommend for you is to always click on special offers, because we have some offers which are incredibly good. So for example, the challenges of supervising risk, £150 instead of 195 at the moment, will expire in 8 days. But before you book, always go into special offers and check whether the course you're interested in maybe is offered to you at the discounted price. Okay, and now featured course is Socratic Questioning Workshop. As I said, 2 days with Paul Grantham. Paul has been running it for quite a few years, but regularly updating, and the course has always been very, very popular. So tonight we will be talking about that course, and we will be talking about Socratic questioning. And I would like to ask my first question, Paul. What exactly is Socratic questioning?
Right. Sort of one of the answer to one of those questions in a single sentence, I guess, isn't it? There's a number of ways of approaching it. I mean, its origins obviously lie outside psychotherapy. They lie, surprise, surprise, originally with Socrates. In the psychotherapy field, it was first embraced as a neo-Freudian idea. So actually Adler was the first person to advocate its particular use. It is in many ways center stage within CBT, and that's, I guess, going to be the primary sort of focus that I'll be taking on Socratic questioning. And it's given a number of sort of terms. It's often seen as synonymous with guided discovery. That's guided discovery with the therapist acting as the guide and the discovery occurring for the client. So one of the sort of metaphors I sometimes take with this is it's a bit like a therapist acting as a Sherpa for somebody who is climbing a very difficult mountain. So it captures a number of things. I ought to add, incidentally, that it also is used in a range of other contemporary settings outside of psychotherapy and outside of CBT. So for instance, it's used as a problem-solving strategy, and it's also used quite extensively as an educational tool as well. But it's all used in slightly different ways. So if I can just sort of zero in on the whole issue of its use within CBT in particular and psychotherapy in particular, it is a questioning style which is designed to address the question with the client of what is it that you know and how do you know it? Which is really the original sort of Socratic definition. I would probably say the only difference really on that from a CBT perspective, I will make a slight alteration to it and say, what do you think that you know? And and why do you think that you know it? So not surprisingly, its focal point is obviously on the client's thinking and their beliefs, and it's in many ways it's a very difficult thing to define in many ways, because it straddles on the one hand what I would describe as being the primary method of communication within CBT. So it's a style, in a way, it's a style of communication with the client. Within the CBT session, it's questioning based, but it also acts as a technique So in that respect, in a strange way, it sits alongside other CBT strategies and techniques which are designed to help the client examine the validity of what it is that they actually think and believe. But I think that what I would have to say as the first starting point with it, which obviously will open up in a lot more detail over the course of the 2 days, is I would always have its first aim as being to enable both the therapist and the client to understand what it is that the client believes and why they actually believe it. So ultimately, yes, it's there to help create change, but I think the first step in it is to aid understanding for both therapist and client. And I'll come back to why it's equally important to do that for the therapist as well as the client I'll come back to later on, really. The other thing I think I'll just briefly say about it before I shut up for a minute, is to say I think that it straddles some fairly different approaches in many ways. It is, on the one hand, I would argue, very client-centered. In a way, interestingly enough, that I've often discovered that a lot of person-centered therapists actually find quite challenging, in the sense that they discover that they are not necessarily as person-centered as they first think. So in many ways, whatever therapeutic modality you come at this from, I think it's got something to teach and something to learn from, and not just from a CBT perspective. So it's very client-centered. And yet, on the other hand, one thing I would have to emphasize is it's not non-directive. So it's collaborative and client-centered, but it's also got a very clear sense of where it's going with the client. So in that respect, it's directional. And I don't mean by that, incidentally, that we impose that direction, although there are one or two underlying assumptions in it. But it's not the case that we could be going anywhere with this. We know, and exactly, that's one of the reasons why I've used the Sherpa metaphor, ultimately, is that, you know, the Sherpa with the climber knows that both of us want to get to the top of the mountain. The Sherpa has a bit more experience about the way in which to go, but there's no point in the Sherpa simply saying to the climber, do this, because you're going to get all sorts of objections to it. So in a way, the Sherpa has to guide, but also stay quite close to the climber, both in terms of where they're going and where the climber wants to go, but also, in addition to that, the speed at which they want to go as well. So yeah, I mean, I'm making it sound like there's a number of different things, elements within it. And I think, incidentally, that it's one of the reasons why, if you look at surveys of accredited CBT therapists, and if you look at those surveys and they say, what would you like more on in your training, there are two areas which are repeatedly highlighted. And the surveys I've seen haven't really changed over the last 15 years, really, which is that I would have liked more work on case formulation. And the other thing is I would have liked a lot more practice on Socratic questioning and guided discovery. And that's one of the reasons why we spend 2 days looking at it, and not just looking at it in detail, people practicing it, preferably to the point of boredom on occasions.
Right. Before we reach that point,
Right.
I need to interrupt you and just focus on a few things you've said, because
Sure.
it was like, so the first thing I wanted to double check. So for Socratic questioning workshop, which you will be delivering, is useful not only for those who work within CBT modality. Would it be fair to say? So if
Yeah,
people are person-centered, transactional analysis, all sorts of other modalities, do they benefit from learning Socratic dialogue?
Yes, they do. And although it will only be fair for me to say that we are primarily going to be focusing on cognitions and beliefs and understandings, my experience repeatedly, I guess, over the years is that people who come at this from a different modality still find the basic approach and the strategies within it equally useful with their own modality. Yes.
Okay, thank you. The second thing which struck me when you were talking, what I know about Socrates, not very much, but what I know about him, that through Socratic dialogue, with his pupils, he was trying to discover and understand various objective and subjective ideas. And at the end of the day, the only thing which is known of Socrates' own words is, I'm only confident in my ignorance. I know that I know nothing, that sort of thing. So would it be true to say that the main purpose of Socratic questioning is to encourage cognitive doubt? Would you say?
Yeah, spot on, really. You're going to have to forgive while I sort of jump in here with making a lot of statements, which I appreciate that if you haven't got, the background on this may sound slightly weird. I start off from an assumption that what might be broadly termed extreme emotions and extreme behavior, which is really, at the end of the day, most of the problems that we're working with as practitioners, typically are the direct product of very strongly held beliefs. And that, generally speaking, moderately held beliefs tend to produce moderate emotions and tend to produce moderate behavior. Now, this is not to say that there aren't examples of strongly held helpful beliefs as well, but I would suggest that for the majority of clients that we work with, they have very strongly held beliefs which interfere with their functioning in terms of extreme negative emotions and extreme behavior as well. So in many ways, I would always argue that the primary strategic approach that exists within CBT is about helping people to function more successfully by enabling them to have more moderate beliefs. Now, I know that that opens up all sorts of issues which are a bit tricky to handle here and now, but how do you move to that particular position? And the answer is, in brief, is for the client to become, on the whole, more cognitively doubtful, more doubtful about their strongly held negative beliefs. If can I just give you a very simple example? It's one that we actually take up in the 3-day course. If I, for example, am suffering from low mood and I have a very strong belief that I am boring, in order to change for the better, I do not need to adopt or learn a positive opposite belief. I don't need to develop a belief that I'm the life and soul of the party. I just need to become more doubtful about whether or not I am basically as boring as I believed I was. And there's other positive things that occur once those negative beliefs are weakened, but that's the main thrust. You're quite right about the creation of cognitive doubt. And I think, although in many ways, Socratic questioning achieves other things as well, I think that's one of its core principles. And one other thing I'll just throw in here again before I shut up, which I should have mentioned earlier on, by the way, which is something which I don't think has been fully recognized and embraced, which is that Socratic questioning, I think, stands shoulder to shoulder with motivational interviewing as a strategy or an approach to use with clients when they are very poorly motivated or resistant or whatever. In other words, where clients basically are saying repeatedly no in some particular way. And I think that it's just an excellent strategic approach and skill set, really, to be able to use with clients to enable clients to feel more motivated and to want to create change for themselves, which I know we all know, don't we? We all work with folks where motivation to varying degrees is an issue.
Well, that's very interesting, because we are running certificate for working with adolescents and adolescent problems. And it just sounds like the type of dialogue you want to have with an adolescent who is questioning everything and holds very, very strong beliefs at the same time while questioning everything. So yes, I think it sounds really useful. My question is, you mentioned that therapists very often list Socratic questioning along with case formulation as something they want to have more training in. Why do you think people find Socratic questioning so elusive and so difficult to grasp?
Very good question. I think the first obvious thing to say about this is there is so little that's actually written about it. You know, I'll say a little bit more about this on the 2-day course, but there's not a lot of literature to draw on. I think that's the first thing to say about it. And so that's one of the reasons why it's sort of been left to one side, really, because one of the most common complaints I think a lot of folks have about Socratic questioning is, I sort of understand the theory, but what exactly do I do? What exactly do I say, really? And I think that there's not a lot of guidance in the literature on that. And I will be spending quite a lot of time on that. There are clearly downsides in creating a menu of the types of questions that you can ask within guided discovery and Socratic questioning. But I would always say it's useful to have some sort of structure to fall back on in terms of types of questions. So I'll be providing that. But interestingly enough, when I originally put this together, I actually drew very heavily on somebody else's writings on this, who interestingly enough is not a psychotherapist at all. They're actually an engineer. And I find it interesting that an engineer has come up with a set of more useful questions, which obviously need adapting within the psychotherapy field, than anything that I've actually read in the psychotherapy field generally, or in the CBT literature. So I think there's just that question that people are still left with, which is, how do I do it? And I think that's one of the sort of key reasons, really. I mean, that begs obviously other questions about why is there so little written on it, but I think that's why people get left with that question.
Well, that's very interesting, because historically we don't have anything written by Socrates himself.
True.
So that's one thing, and
Yep.
basically we are basing not basing our foundation of knowledge of Socrates is based on the writing of, first of all, Plato, his pupil, dialogues with Socrates. So maybe that historical tradition continues, you know, nothing written by Socrates, nobody writes about Socratic questioning. It's a joke. I don't mean.
Yeah, but I think it raises an interesting point, of course, because a lot of what we learn in the original Socratic approach is actually based on dialogue between, and it's recorded as dialogue very often, between teacher and pupil. And we don't even really have that in the psychotherapy literature. And I think in a peculiar way, if that was provided, it would make it a lot easier. But sadly, it doesn't really exist. Yeah.
Well, think about it yourself, because the next question I want to ask is from Edison, who says, Paul has a book about motivational interviewing. How this book can help to develop good Socratic questioning, if at all?
Well, I would say that the two things that they hold in common and are central starting points are about treating the client's view of the world with respect. And I think starting and doing, I mean, that sounds incredibly easy, self-evident. You know, most therapists say, well, of course we do that. But actually, it's not as straightforward as you might first think. Very often, because clients have beliefs about things and they have reasons for believing things, which therapists often fundamentally disagree with, actually, and which creates difficulties. I mean, one of the things I argue specifically, for instance, with Socratic questioning is that although we will go through a structure of questions that you, or I would probably say a menu of questions that can be dipped into and used, I equally think that there's another aspect of this which is much more important in a peculiar way, which is about having the right attitude. And there are some very sort of common attitudinal issues which really need to be grasped, really. One is to enter into a dialogue with the client where we hold as few assumptions as possible. Now, you might think, well, duh, yeah, that's pretty self-evident. Can I just say, having any communication with anybody requires us to hold assumptions. As I'm speaking now, all of you folk here are making assumptions about what you think I'm saying. That's the way communication actually occurs. But, so when I use certain words, for example, you make assumptions about what it is I mean. And that's how communication occurs. But we also know, of course, that misunderstandings based on inaccurate assumptions are extraordinarily common in communication. And therapeutically, that's the same. And that's one issue, which is actually quite, I mean, there are particular Socratic questions to ask to, in a sense, you can never get rid of this problem or potential problem, but you can certainly ask certain things to minimize it, which I'll be going through. The second issue is to basically be as non-judgmental as possible. And again, most people will say, well, duh, you know, that's self-evident, isn't it? But actually it's not. And I'll tell you why it's not. Because every one of us here this evening, for instance, I'm going to assume is in the business of wanting to help people change and have better lives in some particular way. And we have all invested, whether it's in terms of time or money or other sacrifices, we have all invested in learning ways which we think are helpful to achieve that. So I'll put it to you bluntly, it's very difficult when you've made that investment to not start off from the assumption that, putting it very bluntly, we have a better idea than our client has about the best way of approaching things. Now, you might say, yep, but I bite my tongue on things and I try and see things from the client's point of view, and I accept that you do. But actually, these things leak out. And particularly when clients, I think, express underlying beliefs or reasons for those beliefs that the therapist themselves just doesn't hold on to. It's very, very, very tempting for therapists to basically be directive. Now, when I say directive, I don't necessarily mean verbally directive. You know, I've seen instances of, in live supervision, for example, of therapists thinking that they are not expressing a particular opinion, and they're not expressing it verbally, but to me, they leak out non-verbal views on what, and it's very tempting, you know, when someone is repeatedly saying, I believe X, or that this is the best way to go, it's very, very difficult to not think, I'll just see if I can slip something in here to encourage them to think in a different way without it looking too obvious. Well, I'll let you into a secret, folks. People do think people do see it. They're not fools. So there's a whole issue here as well about being non-judgmental too. And I think it's very difficult. I think equally, you know, when you're talking about an approach or a skill which straddles being client-centered, but also on the other hand being directive, that is a very, very difficult straddling to maintain. So one of the things that is a common mistake, I think, that crops up for a lot of therapists is they find themselves falling one side of the line or the other. They end up becoming more directive than really they should be, or alternatively, they lose sight of where they're trying to go with the client. So the whole thing goes around in circles, or they become a little bit like a pinball in a pinball machine. And the great danger there, I think, is that they end up sharing the client's confusion or the client's chaos, rather than being the Sherpa that helps them forward. So I think that part of the skill that's actually around learning Socratic questioning is about learning how to straddle those two rather different, in many ways opposite, aspects of the whole approach. But again, we'll go through that in a great deal of detail and over the 2 days, and there'll be lots of practice opportunities and feedback on it and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Rather than carry on with my own questions, I want to ask a few questions from the chat box, and you're very welcome, guys, to carry on putting them in the chat box or putting your electronic yellow hand up. It used to be blue, it's now yellow. Putting it up and asking your question in person. An interesting question by Tricia, because I think it touches upon positive or negative belief, and how do you classify what is positive or negative belief? Because Tricia is asking, is this the approach which might be used in deprogramming people leaving sects? So people will hold a very strong belief which they probably see as positive, and yet so yeah.
Let's just deal with the first question really, which is what constitutes a bad belief. And my brief answer to that is that any belief which interferes with functioning in some particular way, or alternatively creates negative emotion in the person. So you know, whether that is I think I'm better than everybody else in the human race, which is arguably, strictly speaking, a positive belief, or whether it's I'm totally useless, which is a negative belief, is to some extent irrelevant. It's about its impact on emotion and its impact on functioning. With regards to deprogramming from sex, there are a number of different approaches to that, can I emphasize? But that is certainly one of them. And I would always argue that if you know, you mentioned adolescence earlier on, if you know that trying to help an adolescent to change the way they think and feel is not going to be best served by directly challenging them or telling them how the way they're thinking is wrong, because you know it will simply increase resistance, I hope you can see that if you take somebody from a sect who has very, very strong beliefs, that approach will be potentially fraught with danger. Can I say there are ways of achieving it using direct challenge? But undoubtedly, I would argue, one of the strengths of using a Socratic questioning approach is that it bypasses that motivational obstacle that might be around. So yes, it is used in many circumstances for that particular end. Yeah.
Thank you. People are asking you to give an example of a Socratic question. I just wanted to mention there's no such a thing as a Socratic question. It's a dialogue. That's why we say questioning. So it will have to be a dialogue, but maybe you can give us a quick example.
Let me give you one small example. One small example. I mentioned to you earlier about how easy it is to enter into a conversation with anybody and to make an assumption, for instance. So there's a number of ways in which we can have unhelpful assumptions in our dialogues with clients. We can have unhelpful assumptions about what we think is the most important belief to the client, or the belief that is most central to their problems. And we can actually we can be making assumptions on that and get that totally wrong. But one of the simplest ways in which we can often make assumptions that create problems for us is our automatic acceptance of the words that the client uses to describe things. And that for that reason, one of the most useful questions that I would always argue is around for starting off a Socratic dialogue with a client, would be to ask what's called a clarification question with regards to probably no more than about one or two keywords that the client has expressed in a particular belief statement. So, you know, if I was sitting down, for instance, with a 16-year-old, and that 16-year-old who is very anxious, for instance, about exams and academic work, says to me at some particular point early on, I'm absolutely useless at any exams whatsoever. Okay. Now, there's some really interesting words that are used in that particular belief, which I think it's really important for both myself as a therapist and also the client to explore and to clarify. And for me, well, the first things I would want to ask that client about is what they actually mean by useless. And, you know, the client may actually say, well, for me, what I mean is I'm going to get B's, I'm not going to get A's. And actually getting A's is crucial to me because I will be letting down my parents otherwise. So that's probably a different view of what the term useless means, which is different from the one that I assume. So in that respect, it will be very easy for me to jump into a dialogue with that client where I hope I would never say this directly to the client, but I'm going in with an attitude where I'm thinking to myself, the client thinks they're useless, but they're not really as bad as they think. And that actually my job here is to help the client realize that actually they're better than they think they are. I mean, I'm not saying that we would necessarily say that to the client, but it would be a very understandable attitude for a therapist to actually have in that instance. And actually, it would totally and utterly miss the mark, because that is not really what the client is saying or what it is they believe. And so we could spend a lot of time on that, and it will get us nowhere. In fact, what it might actually do, if we're not careful, is it might increase resistance in the client, and it might lead the client, very understandably, to be honest with you, to be thinking to themselves, this person hasn't got a clue, you know, what my life is like or what the real issue is for me. And they disengage. I mean, that's a very, very simple, very specific and concrete illustration of it, which comes from a very simple question. There's obviously a number of others that are around, but what I would argue should be motivating that question from the therapist's point of view is another element that I've not mentioned at all, but which we're going to spend a lot of time on, which is curiosity. Because I think therapists need to retain a sense of curiosity about their client's experience. And that, can I say, folks, is again another one of those things where we all say, yep, I'm very curious. But can I say, we have all spent our training learning shorthand, whether it's diagnostic, personality characteristics, whatever it is, but it's all shorthand, which is designed to help us to make sense of people's complex experiences. And through the process of doing that, we have a natural inclination Everybody does. Even the people who say they never do. We have a natural inclination to label the client. Now, labeling, I don't mean that in a necessarily pejorative way, by the way, because to deal with complex experience, we need shorthand to help us to know what broad direction we should be going in. But the danger with it is we lose sight of the uniqueness of what it is that the person's thinking in front of us, and that creates all sorts of problems as a result.
Thank you. I wanted to touch upon very quickly. I remember that Deanne Jade, who actually was at our Thursday last week, she invited you to do Socratic questioning workshops specifically for people who work with eating disorders.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of her reasons to do that was that she noticed that lots of people who come to her training are well trained to deal with feelings, but less trained to deal with thoughts and cognitions. Would it be a fair thing to say, or how would you describe that?
I'm going to really stick my neck out here on this. I think that plays a role, but I'm not actually sure it's not that's really about, I would say that's much more about the material that you attempt to elicit from the client. So material that is based on feelings substantially more than is based on beliefs. And I think she's right in that respect. And certainly Socratic questioning within CBT is, relatively speaking, more interested in beliefs than feelings, although it will explore both. But I think there's another much more important reason why it's an obstacle for a lot of folk who are involved in eating problems. Because eating problems, in my opinion, is probably one of those areas par excellence with such a big emphasis on wanting to educate the person, to give them the right information, to give them the right advice. You know, I mean, all you have to do is to pick up a magazine, whatever it is, which will give you advice on food consumption. So actually that danger that I mentioned about being too directive, I actually think is a particular problem for a lot of people involved in the nutrition and eating fields. And can I just say, if you look at the training that most people receive in those fields, it is based on provision of information and the imparting of that particular information to the client. Can I just say, I'm not wanting to knock the idea that information is not valuable in behavior change. All I'm simply saying is, and this raises a very interesting question, by the way, all I'm simply saying is it is not on the whole best achieved through didactically informing the client. So in a way, if for those of you that are involved in the information giving business, which maybe a number of you actually are, in terms of giving information or maybe signposting people, maybe to other services, you know, that they're all advisory roles. There is still a Socratic way of doing that. And again, we'll be covering that over the 2 days. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, before we finish for today, I wanted to, first of all, I invite a few more questions if you have them, but don't have to have any questions. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the structure of the course, because we're saying it's experiential. We're saying you have to be in the room. When I say in the room, in the Zoom room live. We are not back in the room yet. But what exactly will people be doing? Will they be able to practice? Will you be able to actually give some feedback, correct?
Yep.
Or
there will be, the first thing to say is I'm a great believer in the basic skill learning mechanism of demonstration, practice, feedback. There is no better way of learning a skill. And, you know, you can talk about riding bikes until the cows come home, but at the end of the day, you have to see someone ride it, then you have to get on it yourself, probably fall off, then have a chat about it, and then see it again, and so on and so forth. But yeah, so there's going to be lots of demonstration. There's obviously going to be, you know, some structure around, you know, these are the things to practice. But then it'll be, you know, the demonstrations will be followed by practice. They'll then be followed by feedback. The practices will be occurring in pairs during the course of the 2 days. There's an idea that unfortunately is rarely used these days. I think it's a lovely idea, really. It actually comes from the learning disabilities field from probably about 40 or 50 years ago, which is the concept of what's called overpractice. And the concept of overpractice as a skills learning strategy is basically that you don't try and do things once or twice. You repeatedly practice something, preferably to the point of boredom, because that is the way that things become automatic. You know, I'm sure that, you know, you're all familiar with having gone off on courses, for example, and learned something and thought, gosh, that's really great. I can't wait to get back and use that. But actually you fall back into old familiar ways pretty quickly, because we all have default ways of behaving, don't we? So the idea is to get you folks over these 2 days to practice Socratic questioning till you've got to a point where you're bored with doing it. So that when you go back and sit down with your clients, you can immediately switch into it. That's the aim anyway with you.
That's fantastic. Well, before we get bored tonight, we will be closing. I've put the link to Socratic Questioning workshop several times in the chat, but as you know, it's a featured course on SDS website, so on the front page you will find it very easily. So thank you very much, Paul, for very interesting answers today. And thank you all very much for coming. Always good to see you. And as always, you can unmute yourself and say your goodbyes and take care. Have a good evening and we'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care, folks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you
very much.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.
Thank
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Look after yourselves.
You too. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Bye.